She came home ready to lie. I knew it before the key even turned in the lock, because I had learned the choreography of her dishonesty the way you learn a song you hate. Every note, every pause, every false rest. There was the slow scrape of the deadbolt, the little exhale in the hallway where she rearranged her face, and then the door swinging open with just a touch too much cheer. Rachel had a whole performance for coming home late, and I had been the only audience for months. That night she stepped into the kitchen with her coat still on and a valet stub half tucked in her pocket, the kind they only hand out at the 2 or 3 downtown hotels near the convention center. Not at the steakhouse where she'd sworn she had a client dinner. I saw it. She saw me see it. And without missing a beat she told me the parking near the Copper Vine had been a nightmare, that some regional VP had insisted on valeting them all at the Hillcrest across the street, that the whole thing had run 3 hours long and she was exhausted and could we please just not do this tonight. She said it while sliding the stub deeper into her pocket, smiling that bright, brittle smile she saved for people she was managing. And a year earlier, maybe even 6 months earlier, I would have nodded and made her a plate and let the whole thing dissolve into the ordinary noise of a marriage. But that night I didn't move, because I was watching her eyes travel the room, and I was waiting for the exact second they landed on the wall. We had a spot above the entry table where our wedding photo had hung for 8 years. Black frame, the two of us on a dock in Beaufort, her laughing at something the photographer said, my hand at the small of her back like it belonged there. That photo had been the first thing anyone saw walking into our house in Charlotte. That afternoon I had taken it down, and I had hung something else in its place. Her eyes found it, and she stopped. Everything about her stopped. The coat coming off her shoulders froze halfway. The excuse died in her throat. The color drained out of her face in a slow, sick tide. She looked at the new photo on the wall the way you look at your own reflection when you finally see something you've spent years refusing to see. Her mouth opened. Nothing came out. Not a defense, not a question, not even my name. She stood there, coat hanging off one arm, and she could not make herself say Cole. That was how I knew, with a certainty that felt almost peaceful, that it was already over and had been for a long time. I need to tell you what was in that frame, but first I need you to understand how I got there, because I didn't wake up one morning a suspicious man. I was made into one, red flag by red flag over the better part of a year while telling myself I was imagining things. It started small, the way these things do. Rachel was a regional sales director for a medical device company called Meridian Surgical, and her job had always involved travel and dinners and late nights, so at first the changes hid inside things that already existed. The dinners got longer. The travel got vaguer. She stopped telling me the names of the hospitals she was flying to and started saying she was going up north, or to the coast like geography was a state secret. Her phone, which used to live face up on the counter, started living face down, then started living in her bag, then started coming into the bathroom with her while she showered. I noticed. I told myself I was being paranoid because she told me I was being paranoid, and back then her voice still had authority over mine. Then came the perfume. Not that she wore perfume. She'd worn the same bright citrus scent since the day I met her. It was that some nights she came home wearing a different one, something darker and warmer that clung to her collar, and when I mentioned it she said it was a sample from a department store or a coworker's or the lobby diffuser at a hotel. 3 different answers for the same smell over 3 different weeks. I filed each one away without meaning to, the way you file a sound in the walls of a house you think is settling. There was the gym bag that started living in her trunk, though she hadn't been to a gym in years. There was the sudden, unexplained interest in a particular Burlo, a heavy, expensive red she used to call undrinkable, that I had once bought her for an anniversary and watched her leave half full in the glass. Now she knew vintages. Now she talked about it like a hobby. Someone had taught her to love a wine she'd hated, and it wasn't me. And then, the worst of the small things, the money story that didn't add up. In the spring she came home shaken and told me Meridian was restructuring, that her division might get folded, that she'd been staying late to protect her team. She cried a little. I held her. I felt like a good husband. What I didn't know then was that there was no restructuring. I confirmed it later, and that the late nights had nothing to do with saving anyone's job. She had used my sympathy as cover, borrowed my comfort to fund the very thing that was destroying us. When I finally understood that she had cried on my chest about a lie she invented to explain the hours she spent with someone else, Something in me went very cold and very quiet, and it never really warmed back up. I want to be honest about how long I stayed asleep, because I think the shame of that is part of why I did what I did. I stayed asleep for months. I explained away the perfume and the wine and the phone and the geography. I let her tell me I was insecure, that I was projecting, that I'd always had a jealous streak I needed to work on. She was good at it, better than I ever gave her credit for. She could take a real thing I'd noticed and hand it back to me reshaped into a flaw in my character, and I would apologize. I apologized to her for catching her. That's the part one still can't fully forgive myself for. What woke me up wasn't cunning. It was an accident of technology, the kind of thing no one plans and no one can take back. We were on a family cloud plan. Years ago, when we were the kind of couple who shared everything, we'd merged our phones into one shared photo library so vacation pictures and dog pictures and the 100 blurry shots of nothing would all land in the same place. Neither of us had thought about it in years. It ran silently in the background of our marriage, faithfully collecting every image either of our devices captured, sorting them by date, syncing them to the old tablet that lived in a drawer in my home office. The office she never came into anymore because, she said, my clutter gave her anxiety. One ordinary Tuesday, I opened that tablet to find a receipt PDF I'd scanned, and the photo library opened first. And there, at the top of the most recent images, sorted neatly by the machine that did not know how to lie, was a photo I had not taken and she did not know had synced. It was her, asleep, in a bed that was not ours, against a headboard I had never seen, in a room with a brass number plate on the door just visible in the corner of the frame. She was half covered by a white duvet, and the light was low and gold, and it was unmistakably the kind of photo a person takes of someone they've just been with. Someone at ease, someone unguarded, someone who trusts the person holding the phone. Brett had taken it. I didn't know his name yet, but I knew the hand of it. He'd taken it on his phone and it had airdropped or backed up through some app that pushed to her account, and her account still fed the shared library we'd built when we still believed in the word shared. I sat in that office for a long time. I didn't cry. I felt like all the water had been drained out of me and replaced with something heavier. And somewhere in that stillness, a plan started assembling itself, not out of rage but out of a strange engineer's calm. I was done being asleep. I was done apologizing for having eyes. And I understood, holding that tablet, that I had in my hand something she could never talk her way around. Not a suspicion, not a scent, but a photograph, time-stamped, taken in a room she told me she was nowhere near. On a night she told me she was at the Copper Vine with a VP. Over the next 2 weeks I became a ghost in my own house. Every night she was out, and she was out a great deal. I worked. I found out who he was. Brett Halloran, Director of Surgical Purchasing at Ridgeline Medical Center, one of the biggest hospital systems in Rachel's territory. He was, in other words, a client. Her client. The man who signed off on which company's devices his hospital bought. And Rachel's numbers had been extraordinary that year. Ridgeline had become her single largest account. The crown jewel she'd built her promotion case on. I looked at that fact for a long time and felt the second floor of the betrayal give way beneath the first. This wasn't only a marriage coming apart. This was a woman who had blurred the line between the man she was sleeping with and the accounts she was closing. In an industry where that line, once crossed, ends careers and starts investigations. I didn't confront her. Confrontation was what she wanted, what she was built for. A fight she could win with tears and reframes. Instead, I started packing, invisibly. I did the guest room first, then the storage closet in the basement, then, piece by piece, my home office. I took my father's old fishing rods, the record player I'd nearly sold once to afford a gift for her, the quilt my mother made us for our first Christmas. I moved them at night, one bag at a time, into a rented van I parked 2 streets over so she'd never see it from the driveway. She noticed none of it. I had become so peripheral to her that I could dismantle half of our shared life over 14 days and she wouldn't look up from her phone. That, more than the photograph, told me who I'd become to her. I wasn't a husband she was betraying. I was furniture she'd stopped seeing. And on the last night, before I loaded the final bag, I did the one thing that wasn't quiet. I took down our wedding photo. I printed the image from the tablet. Not the whole thing. I couldn't have looked at the whole thing, but a cropped square, her sleeping face, that unfamiliar headboard, the brass room number caught in the corner. I put it in the same black frame our wedding photo had lived in for 8 years, and I hung it in the exact same spot, at the exact same height, so that the first thing she'd see walking into her own home was proof that the machine had caught what she thought she'd deleted. Then I stood in the kitchen and waited for her to come home ready to lie. You already know what happened when she did. She saw it. She froze. She couldn't say my name. And I didn't fill the silence for her, because I had lived inside her silences for a year, and it was finally her turn. I let her stand there and understand it in stages. First that it was a photo, then which photo, then what it meant that it was framed and hung and lit in her own front hall. I watched the whole thing move across her face like weather. And when she finally turned to me, when she opened her mouth to begin the enormous, hopeless labor of explaining it away, I didn't wait to hear it. I walked past her, out the front door I left standing open behind me, down the driveway, and into the December cold. I heard her call after me. I heard her voice climb from confusion to something like panic. I did not turn around. The van was already loaded. I was already gone. I want to be clear about something. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt the specific, hollow relief of setting down a weight you've carried so long you forgot it wasn't part of your body. I drove to my brother Wade's place across town, and he didn't ask me anything. He'd set up the guest room, put clean sheets on the bed, and left a lamp on. He just nodded at me the way you nod at someone coming back from a war, and let me be quiet. Rachel spent the next 2 days trying to find the seams in what I'd done, looking for the loose thread she could pull to make it all come apart. She called the old phone I'd left in my office desk. I'd changed my number, and my old device sat in the drawer lighting up with calls that reached no one. She texted it. She video called it. I imagine at some point she found it, buzzing silently in the dark, and understood that I'd been unreachable the entire time she thought she was reaching me. She reactivated old accounts, messaged mutual friends, and eventually one of her coworkers found me on LinkedIn to ask, carefully, if everything was okay, because Rachel was saying I'd vanished. I didn't answer. I changed my profile to a plain gray square and stripped it of information. Let her chase a shadow. I'd spent long enough being one in my own house. But here is where the story stops being about a man leaving a woman and starts being about how much further the ground had rotted than even I knew. Because on the third day, before I'd made a single move against her, I made a different call entirely. I'd found a name in a work group chat that had synced to that same tablet months ago and that I'd never had reason to notice until now. Anna Halloran, Brett's wife. It took me 20 minutes to find her, a school fundraiser page, a photography Instagram, a real estate listing with her as the agent. I wrote to her the way I'd have wanted someone to write to me. No accusations, no drama. Just that I had reason to believe our spouses had been spending a great deal of time together, that I had proof, and that she deserved to know before she heard it some worse way. She answered within the hour, and what she told me rearranged everything. Anna had thought Brett was traveling constantly for hospital vendor conferences, compliance retreats, purchasing summits, trips that, it turned out, lined up almost perfectly with Rachel's up north and to the coast. But more than that, Anna had been quietly uneasy about money for a year. Brett had come into unexplained comfort. A boat slip he suddenly kept, a watch, a second card she hadn't known about. And there had been a moment, months earlier, when Brett had panicked over an email he thought he'd sent to the wrong person and spent a whole weekend on the phone with someone from work. Anna hadn't understood it then. She understood it now, and so did I. Because in medical device sales, when a purchasing director at a hospital is personally entangled with the sales rep whose contracts he approves, you are no longer looking at an affair. You are looking at a conflict of interest that regulators and compliance departments exist specifically to destroy. We stayed on the phone for 2 hours that first night. Two strangers wrecked by the same two people, comparing timelines, laying our separate humiliations side by side until they formed one continuous picture. And out of that conversation, quietly, a course of action took shape. Not revenge. Something colder and more precise than revenge. The truth delivered to the exact places where the truth would have consequences. Rachel had no idea any of this was happening. She still thought she was the one playing the long game. She still thought I was somewhere licking my wounds, and that if she found the right combination of words, the right blend of tears and reframing, I'd come home and let her rewrite it all again. She sent messages through mutual friends. She started, on her old blog that she hadn't touched since our wedding, posting careful little meditations about growth and being misunderstood and the loneliness of healing in public. She was building a narrative, casting herself as a woman weathering an unfair storm. She was so busy managing her image that she never once considered that the story had already left her hands. The first thing she actually understood was the envelope. I'd left it taped inside the cabinet by the front door. Somewhere she'd only find it if she went digging through the house trying to reconstruct how her husband had turned to vapor. Inside was a single printed receipt, the copper vine, the very steakhouse she'd sworn she was at the night she came home with the valet stub. Except the receipt was real, and I'd pulled it from our joint card statement, and it was for a table for 2 weeks before the night in question. 2 entrees, 2 glasses of the Barolo, 1 bottle of it to finish. That wine. The wine she'd told me for years she couldn't stand. The wine I'd bought her once and watched her leave in the glass. She'd drunk a whole bottle of the memory I gave her, across a candlelit table with him. I knew that receipt would land harder than the framed photo, because the photo was betrayal and the receipt was contempt. It meant she hadn't just replaced me. She'd recycled the tenderest thing I'd ever done and served it to someone else. Then the walls started coming down, and they came down on the side I hadn't even had to push. Anna sent it herself, and I only found out after. A short, clinical email to the compliance office at Ridgeline Medical Center. Formal concern regarding a vendor relationship. She attached what she had: dates, a photograph or 2, records that a spouse quietly keeps when she suspects, and she didn't ask for revenge. She asked for an internal review. In an industry that lives in terror of exactly that phrase, it was all it took. The collapse arrived in stages, and I watched it the way you watch weather roll in from a porch. First, Brett was put on administrative leave pending review. Then Rachel's Meridian access went dark. Her corporate email bounced. Her calendar vanished. Her biggest account got flagged for audit because you cannot review a purchasing director without reviewing the rep whose contracts crossed his desk. Within 2 weeks, her LinkedIn quietly changed to say she was open to opportunities. And she said nothing about it, which was its own kind of scream, because Rachel narrated everything. Silence from her meant free fall. Brett did what men like Brett do. He saved himself. Anna told me he told the reviewers it had all been Rachel, that she'd pursued him, that she'd leveraged the relationship, that he'd been the one manipulated. He'd even, at some point during it all, used my name to Anna, told her that I knew about the dinners and was fine with them, that Rachel and I had some kind of understanding. He'd made me a prop in his lie, a spineless background husband who'd signed off on his own erasure. When Anna read me those texts over the phone, my hands shook. Not with heartbreak, I'd spent that months ago, but with the specific fury of a man learning he'd been written out of his own life and recast as a fool by people eating dinner on his memory. By the time Rachel understood the full shape of what was happening to her, there was nothing left to control. Brett got quietly transferred out of state and stopped answering her entirely. Meridian, facing an audit, was never going to keep the rep at the center of it. Her income vanished. And the condo we co-owned, the one she assumed she'd keep, the one she tried to move fully into once Wade's guest room stopped feeling temporary to me, was suddenly wrapped in the polite, immovable language of a lawyer I'd retained, because I'd stopped being the man who cleaned up her messes and started being the man who documented them. She began the long, undignified crawl back. Not to me at first, but to everyone else. Mutual friends, her sister, the comment sections of her own blog. She recast herself over and over as the misunderstood one, the woman punished for a private mistake, the victim of a vindictive ex. What she didn't know was that Anna had kept the emails, and that copies of the relevant records had already reached people in the industry who mattered, and that the story simply wasn't hers to spin anymore. She was still trying to control a narrative that had been out of her hands for weeks. She only knew one thing for certain. I was still silent. And this time my silence wasn't the weakness she'd once said she loved in me. It was a fuse that had already reached the end. She finally came for me directly about 6 weeks after the door. She'd figured out where Wade lived. She was always good at finding people when it served her, and she showed up on his porch in a beige coat, sunglasses on despite the gray, standing straight like she was walking into a negotiation she still believed she could win. Wade opened the door a few inches. I watched from the top of the stairs out of sight. She kept her voice level and reasonable and asked, just to talk, just for a minute. But Wade had heard me 2 nights earlier through the wall. The ugly, gulping sound of a grown man reading old messages he was never meant to see. He told her I wasn't ready and shut the door. She didn't knock again. She sat down on the step and waited, the way she used to wait for things she was sure would eventually come to her. Nothing came. Eventually she left. Took the rain to finally break her. She came back on a night in the middle of a storm, and this time there was no coat drawn straight, no sunglasses, no posture. Just Rachel, soaked through, mascara streaking, hair flat against her face. No phone, no bag, no umbrella. Wade was out. I stood in the kitchen and watched her through the window for a long moment, and I thought about letting the rain finish it. But I wanted to see what was left of the woman who had once cried at other people's divorces and swore, with her whole chest, that she would never become the kind of person who did this to someone she loved. So I opened the door and let her stand just inside it, far enough to be out of the weather and no farther. She told me she'd lost everything. Not officially fired, but blacklisted. Nobody in the industry returning her calls. Brett gone to another state and refusing her. Him telling the review it had all been her. Her lease ending, the condo blocked, nowhere to land. She said she never thought I'd actually leave. And that was the truest thing she said, because she hadn't. She had built her entire strategy on the certainty that I would always fold, always forgive, always be there to tape the mirror back together after she cracked it. She had never once planned for the version of me that walked out the open door. I didn't offer her a towel or a chair. I told her, finally, the only thing I'd come to understand with real clarity. That she hadn't lost me. That losing implies you were holding something and it slipped away. She hadn't lost me. She'd spent me night after night, like loose change she didn't bother to count. Her face fell, and for the first time in all the years I'd known her, I watched something arrive in it that wasn't strategy. Not guilt, which she could perform. Shame, which she couldn't. She started to say she never meant for it to go this far, and I stopped her because that had never been the wound. The affair was a knife, but the wound was everything around it. That she'd looked me in the eye and told me I was paranoid while she smelled like someone else. That she'd cried on my chest about a fake restructuring to explain the hours she spent with him. That she'd let me apologize to her for noticing. I didn't leave because she cheated. I left because she made me feel insane for being right, and then wrote herself a role as the brave one weathering an unfair storm while I quietly bled out in a house I'd already started dismantling around us. She had no script for that. For once, she just nodded and cried and had nothing to say. I watched her walk back out into the rain and down the steps into the streetlight, and she didn't beg and she didn't yell and she didn't turn around. She just went, small and soaked, swallowed by a storm she'd made herself. And I stood in the doorway and felt the thing I'd been waiting 8 years to feel without knowing I was waiting. Not empty, not vindicated, free. The quiet after was a different animal than the quiet before. For years I'd lived inside a silence that felt like suffocation. Her cold silences, her withheld attention, the vast noiselessness of being unseen by the person who was supposed to see me most. The silence after she left my brother's porch was the opposite. It was room to breathe. Nobody was going to knock. Nobody was building a case against me in the next room. The story had ended and I was allowed to just stop. I signed a lease on a small 2-bedroom across town. Hardwood floors, a balcony that caught the morning sun. Nothing fancy and all mine. I unpacked slowly, in no hurry, and I let each box tell me what to keep. The wedding album went to the trash, not out of cruelty but because it had stopped being true. Her old letters, the ones that had once meant something, I shredded. But my father's rod stayed. The record player stayed. My mother's quilt stayed, and it felt heavier in my hands now, more real, the way things do when you almost lose the version of yourself that valued them. I went back to work. I started running again in the gray early mornings. I started cooking for myself like the person eating the food mattered. Healing wasn't a straight line. Some days I missed her like a phantom limb. Some nights I woke reaching across a bed that had one person in it and had for a while. But most days what I missed wasn't her. It was me, the man I'd been before I learned to check whether it was safe to laugh out loud. And then, without looking for it, it happened. Her name is Sarah. She runs a plant nursery a few blocks from my apartment. A warm greenhouse that smells like soil and rain even in winter. And I wandered in one Saturday to buy something green to put on the balcony and ended up talking to her for an hour about nothing at all. It wasn't fireworks. It was quiet, and quiet was what I'd been starving for. Not the suffocating kind, the breathing kind. She doesn't ask about my past unless I offer it. She listens with attention instead of agenda. The first time I really laughed around her, the deep unguarded kind, I realized I couldn't remember the last time I'd done it without permission. A few weeks ago, I walked past the old house, the one Rachel and I had built our fiction inside. It was late and warm, and I stood across the street looking up at the front window where the wedding photo used to hang. Then the other photo, then nothing. The curtains had changed. New people, a new life, no ghosts of ours left in the glass. I don't know where Rachel is now, whether she rebuilt or didn't. That part of the story stopped belonging to me the night she walked into the rain, and I've stopped needing to know how it ends for her. Because in the end, I didn't just walk away from a woman who lied to my face. I walked back toward the man who'd been standing in that hallway all along, quiet, unseen, taking down one photo and hanging up another. The one thing in that whole house she couldn't explain, couldn't reframe, couldn't say a single word against. She came home ready to lie, and she saw the truth on the wall, and she couldn't even say my name. But I could. For the first time in years, I could say it and mean it, and it was finally only mine.